She was drugged, she was being hunted, and the most dangerous man in Manhattan was the only thing standing between her and the dark. Before this story ends, one man will burn everything he built to protect a woman he was never supposed to love. And one woman will have to decide whether the arms that saved her are the same arms she wants to fall into forever. If you're watching from your city tonight, drop its name in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the last second, and let's begin. The rain came down hard on Hell's Kitchen, the kind of rain that didn't care about umbrellas or timing, or the fact that Alara Quinn had exactly $11.40 left in her checking account and a subway card that hadn't worked since Tuesday. She stood outside the back entrance of Cafe Meridian with her jacket pulled tight across her chest and her sneakers already soaked through the soles, watching the last of the dishwashers lock up and disappear into the dark without a word in her direction. That was fine. She didn't need conversation. She needed sleep, a working radiator, and maybe one night, just one, where she didn't lie awake doing math that never added up. It was 12:18 in the morning. She had a 40-minute walk or a cab she couldn't afford. Alara started walking. The city looked different this late. Not dangerous exactly, not at first glance, but hollowed out. Like the daytime version of New York had packed up and left, and what remained was the version that didn't bother pretending. Neon signs bled color into puddles. A man in a soaked hoodie stood motionless under a scaffolding awning 2 blocks up, watching her with the kind of stillness that made her cross the street without deciding to. She'd learned that reflex a long time ago. You didn't think about it. You just moved. She'd been in the city 3 years. 3 years of graphic design portfolios submitted to agencies that never called back. 3 years of freelance gigs that paid late or didn't pay at all. 3 years of sharing a 1-bedroom in Washington Heights with a roommate who played music until 3 in the morning and once ate an entire box of food Alara had labeled with her name in red marker. 3 years of telling herself this was the grind, this was the cost, this was what you paid before the thing you were building finally stood on its own. She was starting to wonder if the thing was ever going to stand. The cafe job was supposed to be temporary. It always was. $11 an hour plus tips. Except the tips had been thin lately, and her manager, a pinched, humorless man named Derek, had cut 2 of her shifts last month without explanation and replaced them with a 19-year-old named Cody who had the customer service instincts of a golden retriever and never once remembered that oat milk cost extra. Alara had not said anything about this. She'd smiled and nodded and taken the remaining shifts and told herself she was being strategic, not defeated. She was very good at lying to herself. She'd had a lot of practice. The rain thickened. She ducked under the awning of a closed dry cleaner and pulled out her phone to check the time. And that was when she saw the message from her landlord. Rent was going up. $47 more per month, effective the 1st of next month, which was 16 days away. The message was polite, even apologetic in tone, which somehow made it worse. She stood there reading it twice, the screen going blurry at the edges, and then she put the phone back in her pocket and stood very still for a moment with her jaw tight and her eyes fixed on the middle distance. Then she kept walking. She'd been handling Martin Hale for about 3 months. That was the word she used in her head. Handling. Because it was precise and because it kept the thing at a distance where she could manage it. He was a regular at the cafe, always the corner booth, always the same order, black coffee, no food, sometimes a glass of water he never touched. He came in on Fridays between 9 and 10, and he always sat facing the room, and he always watched her. Not in an obvious way. That was the problem. If it had been obvious, she could have gone to Derek, and Derek could have done something, or at least could have tried. But Martin Hale was smooth in the way that certain men were smooth. The kind of smooth that was the product of long practice, of having learned exactly how much attention to pay before it crossed a line anyone could point to. He never stared. He just oriented toward her, the way a plant orients toward light, quietly, persistently, in a way you noticed without being able to prove. He left good tips. He was always polite. He asked her about her day in a way that seemed like genuine interest and not the practiced warmth of a man performing normalcy for an audience. She'd mentioned offhand once, 3 months ago, that she was a graphic designer, just to fill a gap in conversation, the way you mention things to regulars. And since then, he'd asked about it every time. He remembered details. He asked follow-up questions. He nodded in the right places. It should have been fine. It didn't feel fine. But Alara was 26 years old and had been told her whole life that she was too sensitive, too quick to assume bad intentions, too guarded for no reason. She had an ex-boyfriend 2 years ago who'd spent the better part of 8 months convincing her that her instincts were the problem, that the anxiety she felt in certain situations was hers to fix, not a signal worth listening to. She'd believed him for a while. She'd worked very hard to be less like herself. She was still unlearning that. So when Martin Hale set a coffee cup on the counter near closing time and said he'd asked the barista to make one for her, for the walk home, such a miserable night, she shouldn't have to go out in that without something warm. She stood there for a moment doing the calculation. The rational calculation. The one where you weighed the cost of being rude to a regular against the vague, unproven, probably paranoid discomfort in your chest. She took the cup. She should not have taken the cup. She knew that on some level, even as her hand closed around it, but the knowing was soft and indistinct, buried under exhaustion and the $11.40 and the landlord's polite apologetic message. And she was so tired, so fundamentally bone-deep tired, that the alarm in her body barely registered above the noise. "Have a safe walk," Martin said. "Thanks," she said, and meant nothing by it, and went out into the rain. She made it 4 blocks before the edges of her vision started to soften. It came on slow, then fast. That was the thing she would remember later. The deceptive slowness of the first few minutes, just a mild heaviness behind her eyes. The kind of fatigue that made sense at 12:30 in the morning after a 6-hour shift. She thought maybe the walk in the rain was catching up with her. She thought maybe she needed to eat. She stopped at a corner and blinked hard and looked at the street sign overhead, and found she had to concentrate to make the letters stay still. Then the sidewalk tilted, not dramatically, not like a movie, just a slight nauseating shift in the angle of things, like the ground had decided it was no longer interested in being level. Alara grabbed the nearest surface, which turned out to be a chain-link fence bordering a construction site, and held on with both hands while the world recalibrated itself around her. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. Her hands felt distant, like they belonged to someone else and she was just borrowing them. Something is wrong. The thought arrived clear and cold through the gathering fog. Something is very wrong. She turned, slowly, carefully, holding the fence, and looked back the way she'd come. The street was mostly empty. The rain was still falling. The neon of a bar sign a block up threw broken red light across the wet pavement. And there, half a block behind her, walking at an unhurried pace under a black umbrella, was Martin Hale. He was watching her. He wasn't pretending this time. Alara turned back around and pushed off the fence and tried to walk faster, and her legs answered the instruction with a delay that terrified her, like the signal from her brain was traveling through something thick and resistant before it arrived. She made it another half block. The rain was in her eyes. She could feel her knees threatening to buckle with every step, and she was fighting them through sheer, furious will, her teeth clenched, her breath coming in short, ragged pulls. She tried to reach for her phone and couldn't get her fingers to work the zipper of her jacket pocket. She was going to fall. She could feel it the way you could feel a wave before it hit, the certainty of it, the physical inevitability. And there was no one on the street, no one close enough to see her, and Martin Hale was behind her, and he knew exactly what was happening because he had made it happen, and the headlights came from nowhere. A black SUV, moving fast, cut across the intersection 40 feet ahead of her and braked hard, the tires throwing water. It sat there for half a second, engine running. Then the driver's side rear door opened and a figure stepped out into the rain. And Alara's first thought, through the fog and the panic, was that he was large, genuinely, unusually large. Not just tall, but built with the kind of deliberate solidity that made you recalculate distances. And her second thought was that she had no idea if this was better or worse. He crossed the distance between them in about 6 strides. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see rain running down a face that was sharp-boned and dark-eyed and entirely unreadable. And he looked at her. Really looked, a fast, clinical assessment. And then he looked past her down the street. Something changed in his expression. She didn't have the vocabulary for what it was. Not anger exactly. Something older and colder than anger. Something that had already made a decision. "Can you walk?" he said. His voice was low. It was not a gentle voice. It was the voice of someone who had never needed to be gentle to get what he wanted. I don't She heard herself. She sounded drunk. She hated the sound. I don't know you. No, he said. You don't. He said it like she'd stated a simple fact, not a protest, like the distinction was irrelevant. She heard footsteps behind her. Martin's footsteps. Closer now. My name is Luca Moretti, the man said, still not looking at her, still watching the point behind her where Martin Hale was approaching through the rain. And the man behind you put something in your coffee, so I'm going to ask you one more time. Can you walk? The ground pitched again. Alara's grip on consciousness narrowed to a single bright point. No, she admitted. Okay, he said, and he picked her up. Not roughly, not gently either, with an efficiency that suggested he was solving a logistical problem, not cradling something fragile. She was against his chest with one arm under her knees and one at her back before she'd finished processing that it was happening, and her body, exhausted, frightened, losing the fight with whatever Martin Hale had put in that cup, made a decision she hadn't authorized and went still. She heard voices behind her. Luca's men. There were others she registered dimly. She couldn't see them, but she could hear the specific quality of authority being exerted, of something being resolved through means she wasn't clear on. She heard Martin's voice spike suddenly in surprise, or fear. Then she didn't hear it anymore. Luca Moretti was already moving toward the SUV. Stay with me, he said. Not kindly, not harshly, like a command with no emotional content, the kind you gave when you needed compliance and didn't have time for anything else. Alara tried. For about 30 seconds, she tried very hard. Then the darkness took her anyway. She came back to herself in pieces. Warmth first. The specific warmth of a space that was temperature-controlled with precision, neither the dry blast of cheap apartment heating nor the damp chill of the city, but something calibrated and even. Then light. Soft, indirect, coming from sources she couldn't immediately locate. Then the ceiling, which was high and white and featured crown molding that her designer's eye registered and cataloged even before the rest of her brain had fully rejoined the conversation. That ceiling did not belong to her apartment. She sat up faster than she should have and immediately regretted it. The room swam. She pressed both hands flat against the surface beneath her. A bed, enormous, with sheets that had a thread count her fingers couldn't quantify, and breathed through the dizziness until it settled. The room was large and spare and expensive in the way that truly expensive things were, not cluttered with proof of their own cost, just simply and obviously occupying a different tier of material reality. A floor-to-ceiling window across from her showed Manhattan at night, a grid of lights that from this height looked like something spread out for examination, not a city you lived inside of. She was high up, very high up. There was a glass of water on the nightstand with a folded note beneath it. She picked up the note. Drink the water. It will help. You are safe. When you're ready, come out. No signature. She didn't need one. She drank the water. She sat for another minute, taking stock. Her jacket and shoes had been removed. Everything else was intact. She noticed this with a detached precision, checking the inventory of herself the way you checked a room after a storm, not with relief exactly, but with the particular quiet of someone who'd been braced for worse. The nausea was retreating. Her head still felt packed with something dense and uncooperative, but she could think in straight lines now, and the immediate animal terror of the street had compressed itself into a tight, manageable knot somewhere in her sternum that she knew from experience she could carry. She got up. She was steadier than she expected. She crossed the room to the door, which was closed but not locked, and opened it onto a hallway that continued the visual language of the bedroom. Understated, impeccable, lit by recessed fixtures that threw warm light downward in a way that felt almost architectural in its deliberateness. She followed the hallway to the end and came out into a living room. It was not the living room of someone who wanted you to know they were wealthy. It was the living room of someone who had stopped thinking about it long enough ago that the question of display no longer applied. The furniture was minimal and clearly chosen rather than assembled. A low sofa in dark gray, a glass-topped coffee table with 3 books stacked on it, a rug that Alara's eye read immediately as handmade and old. The walls held art, not prints, not reproductions, actual paintings of varying scale arranged with the careful asymmetry of someone who understood composition. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at all of it and thought, I am in the home of someone who is not like any person I have ever met. You're up. She turned. Luca Moretti was in the kitchen, which occupied the far end of the open-plan space behind a marble island. He had changed out of his wet clothes into dark pants and a plain dark shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbow, and he was standing at the stove with his back partially turned, not looking at her, doing something with a small saucepan. He looked, in this context, both more and less dangerous than he had in the rain. More, because she could see him clearly now. The structure of him, the complete and total absence of uncertainty in the way he occupied physical space, the way men who had never once in their lives been unsure of their own authority tended to occupy it. He was in his mid-30s, she thought. Dark hair. The face she'd half seen on the street was sharper in the light, all angles and shadows, the kind of face that had never been pretty and had never needed to be. Less dangerous because he was making her tea. She realized this a moment after she'd registered the saucepan. The smell hit her then. Chamomile, something else, faintly sweet. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. He didn't turn around. Sit down. She thought about the multiple different responses available to her and chose none of them and sat down on the edge of the gray sofa. The coffee table books were face up, Stoic philosophy, a monograph on Basquiat, a collection of essays on urban architecture. She stared at them for a moment with an expression she was glad no one could see. Luca came around the island and set a mug in front of her on the coffee table. Then he sat in the chair opposite, not close, not a comfort distance, more the distance of a meeting. And he looked at her with dark eyes that were doing something she couldn't classify, some kind of assessment that was thorough without feeling intrusive. How are you feeling? He said. Like I was drugged, she said. Yes. No apology in it, just acknowledgement. Do you know what he gave me? Probably flunitrazepam. My people are handling that. Your people, she repeated. She looked at him steadily. Who are you exactly? I told you my name. Luca Moretti, she said. I heard you. I'm asking what that means. Something shifted in his expression. Not discomfort. She didn't think discomfort was in his range, but a kind of attentiveness, like the question had interested him slightly. He leaned back in the chair and looked at her with his forearms resting on his knees and said, What do you think it means? I think, Alara said carefully, that you arrived at the exact right moment on an empty street in the middle of the night with multiple people who made Martin Hale disappear in about 30 seconds. She paused. I think that doesn't happen unless you already knew something was going to happen, or unless you're the kind of person whose presence makes things disappear. He was quiet for a moment. The second one, he said. Organized crime, she said. That's one way to say it. What's another way? I run things in this city, he said. Certain things. The kind of things that don't have official management. He said it without inflection, without the self-conscious edge of a man confessing or a man performing, just a fact being delivered. The man who drugged you has been on my radar for a while. Last night was the first time I had enough to act. Alara picked up the mug and held it in both hands and breathed in the steam and tried to think. He targeted me specifically, she said. It wasn't a question. We believe so, for some time. Something cold moved through her chest. How long? Luca's jaw tightened slightly. At least 3 months? She absorbed that. The timeline of it. Every Friday, every carefully calibrated interaction, every question about her design work, every good tip, every small performed kindness that she'd almost convinced herself she was imagining wrong. She had not been imagining it wrong. What happens to him now? She said. Luca looked at her. He won't come near you again, he said. That's not what I asked. No, he said. It's not. The silence held between them for a moment. She understood then, with a clarity that surprised her with its steadiness, that the question of Martin Hale's fate was not actually the question she needed answered. She understood what Luca was telling her, and she understood that she was sitting in the home of a man who had the authority to tell it. And she found, checking the inside of herself for the expected horror, that what she felt instead was something flat and absolute and hard. Good. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't have to. You can stay here tonight, Luca said. There's a second bedroom. No one will come in. He said this with a directness that made clear the statement was not an offer in need of negotiation. It was a logistical arrangement being communicated. In the morning, I can have someone take you wherever you need to go. I need my jacket and shoes, she said. Closet by the front door. She nodded. She should have left. She knew she should have left. Every sensible instinct she had, the ones her ex-boyfriend had spent 8 months trying to talk her out of, and the ones she'd spent 2 years rebuilding, was generating a quiet, firm signal that said, "You don't know this man. You don't owe this man. You get your shoes, and you thank him, and you go." She knew how to leave rooms. She'd been leaving rooms her whole life. She didn't leave. She sat there with her hands around the mug and looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the grid of Manhattan lights below and said, "Why were you watching him, Martin? What put him on your radar?" Luca was quiet for a long moment. "Someone I knew," he said finally, "a long time ago." He said it the way you said things that had been compressed down to their smallest possible form through years of not saying them. She didn't have anyone watching. Alara looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the window, at the city, at something in it or past it that she couldn't see. She thought about 3 years of learning to carry things without putting them down. She thought about the weight of knowing you'd almost been right about your own instincts, but almost wasn't the same as being listened to. She thought about the woman he'd just referenced, the compressed grief of that single sentence, the way some losses reduced themselves over time into one short thing you said and then stopped. She did not ask him to say more. "Okay," she said. "I'll stay tonight." He nodded. He got up and took his own glass to the kitchen without another word, and Alara sat in the enormous quiet of his penthouse and looked out at the city that had never once looked back and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could accurately account for. Not safe, exactly, but seen. She told herself it was the aftermath of the drug, the disorientation of the night, the simple human response to having been frightened and then not frightened. She told herself it would look completely different in the morning light. She was right about that. It would look different in the morning light. But different wasn't the same as wrong. She didn't sleep much. The second bedroom was exactly what Luca had described. Spare, clean, private, the door with a lock she used, and she lay on her back in the dark for hours, watching the city light shift across the ceiling and running the night through her head in pieces. The moment she took the cup, the moment her vision had gone soft, the moment she'd turned and seen Martin behind her with the umbrella and the absence of pretense. The moment Luca Moretti had asked if she could walk and she'd said no, and he'd picked her up like the answer was the simplest thing in the world. At some point before dawn, she fell into a short, dense sleep with no dreams she could remember. She woke to light and the smell of coffee. Real coffee. Not cafe coffee, not the burned bottom smell of Cafe Meridian's ancient commercial machine, but something that suggested a French press and beans ground that morning, and a person who had decided coffee was worth doing right. She found her jacket and shoes by the front door exactly where he'd said. She put them on and stood in the entryway for a moment with her hand not quite on the door handle, listening to the sounds from the kitchen. Quiet, unhurried, the sounds of a person who lived alone and had constructed a morning routine that required no audience. She went to the kitchen. He looked up when she came in. He was standing at the island with a mug and a newspaper, an actual physical newspaper, which she registered with a blink, and he looked at her in the morning light with the same opaque attentiveness he'd shown the night before. "Coffee?" he said. "Yes," she said, because she had never in her life turned down coffee, and she wasn't going to start now. He poured her a cup and set it on the island and went back to his newspaper. She sat down on one of the island stools and wrapped her hands around the mug and looked around the kitchen in the morning light and thought, "This is the strangest thing that has ever happened to me." The kitchen was extraordinary. Professional-grade range, marble counters that weren't decorative, a knife block with actual useware on the handles. Someone cooks seriously in this kitchen. Someone had opinions about it. "You cook," she said. "Yes." "Yourself." "Usually." "Huh." She looked at the knife block. "I would not have guessed that." He turned a page of the newspaper. "What would you have guessed?" "I don't know. People who bring food in? Chefs on call?" She paused. "Someone else's kitchen." "I grew up cooking," he said. "Not defensively, not warmly either, just offered, like a data point." "It's something I do." She sat with that for a moment. "Alara Quinn," she said. In case you didn't already know my full name." "I know your full name," he said without looking up. "Of course you do." She drank her coffee. It was very good. "And you're going to tell me this is a one-time thing, that someone takes me wherever I need to go, and that's the end of it." He put down the newspaper. He looked at her directly, and there was something in the look that was different from the look on the street and different from the look last night. Something that was trying to be neutral and wasn't entirely succeeding. And she filed that away with the precision of a person who had learned to pay attention to what other people were trying not to show. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On what you want it to be." Alara Quinn looked at Luca Moretti across a kitchen island in a penthouse 37 floors above Manhattan, with a good cup of coffee in her hands and the wreckage of last night still fresh in her nervous system, and a future that as of 16 days from now was going to cost $47 more per month than it currently did. She thought about the look on Martin Hale's face when he'd seen Luca step out of that SUV. She thought about the way the pretense had dropped. She thought about what it meant that someone had been watching her for 3 months, and the city had not noticed, and this man had. "I want to know what happened to him," she said. "Martin." Luca held her gaze. "I already told you what happened to him." "I know what you told me," she said. "I'm asking you to say it." A long pause. The city sounds drifted up from 37 floors below. A siren, somewhere distant. The structural murmur of a building this size settling into the morning. "He won't hurt anyone again," Luca said. "Ever." The finality in it was absolute. And Alara Quinn, who had spent 3 years in a city that kept looking away, who had carried every alarm and every instinct and every shred of herself for so long without anyone to help her hold the weight. Alara Quinn held Luca Moretti's gaze and said nothing. She didn't need to. She reached for her coffee. He reached for his newspaper. And in the quiet of that morning, in the strange and unexpected stillness of a life that had just turned on its axis, neither of them acknowledged what they both already felt beginning. But it had already begun. That much was certain. The only question now was what they were going to do about it. And neither of them was ready to answer that yet. Not yet. She left at 9:17 in the morning. Luca had offered a car and she'd said yes because her legs were still not entirely trustworthy and because declining felt like a performance of independence she hadn't earned back yet. The driver was a compact, quiet man named Enzo, who held the door without making it a gesture and didn't speak for the entire 40-minute ride uptown, which Alara appreciated more than she could have articulated. She sat in the back of the black sedan with her jacket zipped and her coffee still warm in her memory, and watched Manhattan slide past the tinted windows like a film she was watching from outside rather than a city she lived in. She got out on her block in Washington Heights and stood on the sidewalk until the car disappeared around the corner, and then she went upstairs and stood in her apartment doorway for a long moment, just looking at it. It was small. It had always been small, but it had never felt quite this small before, which was the penthouse's fault, and she knew it and resented it slightly. Her desk in the corner with the monitor she'd bought secondhand and the sketch pad she'd been filling since art school. The shelf with the design books she'd collected over 3 years at half price and full price, and occasionally from sidewalk-free boxes. The window that faced the brick wall of the adjacent building and let in about 90 minutes of direct light per day if the angle was right and the season cooperative. Her roommate, Jess, was still asleep. The music had stopped. The apartment was quiet. Alara sat down at her desk and opened her laptop and looked at her inbox and found nothing in it that required her immediate attention and nothing in it that offered her any money. She closed the laptop. She put her hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall above her monitor, where she'd taped a printout of a design she'd done 2 years ago that she still thought was the best thing she'd ever made. Clean, uncluttered, a branding concept for a fictional company she'd invented just to have something to show agencies. 18 rejections from those agencies, the last of which had said politely that her work was interesting but not quite what they were looking for right now. She'd left the printout up anyway. She didn't know yet if that was stubbornness or delusion. She went to the bathroom and washed her face with cold water and looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like someone who'd been through something and slept a few hours at the far end of it. Her eyes had a rawness around the edges she recognized. Not crying, just the specific wear of a night that had asked a lot. She dried her face and went back to her desk, and this time she opened her design software and worked for 3 hours without stopping, not on anything commissioned, just working, which was what she did when she needed her brain to go somewhere her body couldn't follow. Her phone buzzed at 1 in the afternoon. Unknown number. She stared at it through 2 full rings before she answered. "This is Alara." "I know." Luca's voice. Even through the phone it had that quality. Not loud, just present in a way that didn't leave room for doubt. "How are you feeling?" "Better." She paused. "How did you get this number?" "You left your jacket in my car." She looked at the hook by her door. Her jacket was not on it. "Enzo has my jacket." "He does. He can bring it whenever's convenient." "That's a very elaborate way to get someone's phone number." A short pause that might have been the beginning of something but didn't develop into it. "I wanted to know you were home." She sat with that for a moment, the directness of it. No softening, no pretense of a practical reason. "I'm home," she said. "Good." Another pause. "There's something you should know. About Martin Hale." Her grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Tell me." "Not over the phone. Are you free this evening?" She almost said, "Free for what exactly?" She almost said, "I work tonight." Both were true, and both felt wrong, as the first thing out of her mouth. What she actually said was, "I have a shift at 6. I'm off by 11. I'll send a car at 11:15. "Luca." She stopped. "You can't just send cars at me. I don't—" She looked at the wall, at the printout, at the design she'd made that no one had wanted. "I don't know how to do this. Whatever this is." "Neither do I," he said. She hadn't expected that. 11:15, she said finally. "Yes." He hung up without goodbye, which she was beginning to understand was not rudeness, but simply the way he operated, efficiently, without social filler, trimming everything down to what was necessary. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment after the call ended and thought about what that meant about a person, and couldn't decide if it frightened her or interested her or both simultaneously, which was its own kind of answer. The shift was bad, not catastrophic bad, just the particular sustained bad of a Friday night where every table turned over fast, and the kitchen was backed up, and Derek stood at the service counter with his arms crossed, doing the thing he did when he wanted everyone to know he was monitoring the situation without actually doing anything about it. Alara moved through it the way she moved through all of it, economically, keeping the volume in her head low enough to function, and she took her tables and kept her orders straight and smiled at the right moments and collected her tips and thought about very little except the mechanics of the next 5 minutes. Around 9 o'clock, she looked up from the counter where she was waiting on 2 cafe lattes and found herself looking at Martin's booth. Empty. Obviously empty. He wasn't coming back. She knew that with a certainty that went all the way down to bedrock. She looked at the empty booth for 1 full second, and then she looked away and picked up the lattes and kept moving. At 11:10, she was outside with her apron in her bag and the night air on her face, and the black sedan was already there when she came out, which meant Enzo had arrived early and was sitting with the engine off and the patience of a man who had spent years waiting on someone else's schedule. This time, she got in without hesitation. Luca was not at the penthouse when she arrived. Enzo took her up and let her in with a card key and said, with the maximum economy of words, 20 minutes, and then left. Alara stood in the entryway and looked at the living room, and then walked to the kitchen and found a plate of food covered with a cloth on the island. Something that smelled like roasted garlic, and something else, warm, substantial, and a note in handwriting that was angular and direct and looked exactly like she would have guessed. Eat. You've been on your feet 6 hours. She ate. She was halfway through it. Pasta, she realized, with a short rib ragu that was complicated and careful and the work of someone who had started it hours ago. When she heard the elevator and then the front door. Luca came in still wearing his coat, which he removed and hung without hurry. He looked at her at the island and then at the plate, and something in his expression did a thing she filed away without naming. "Sit down," she said. "You made it. You should eat." He seemed briefly surprised. Not visibly, but there was a fractional pause that suggested the invitation was unexpected. Then he came around the island and got a plate and served himself and sat across from her at the island, and they ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which itself was a kind of information. "Tell me," she said, when the plates were mostly done. He put down his fork. He looked at her directly and said, "Martin Hale had a storage unit in Maspeth. My people found it last night." "Found what?" "Documentation," Luca said. Photographs, records going back 6 years. The cold settled in her chest again. Other women. 11 that we can confirm. Probably more. 11. She looked at the countertop. She ran the number through her head and found it didn't process cleanly. It kept trying to be abstract, and she kept forcing it back into the specific, into faces and names she didn't know, and nights those women had walked home or tried to, and what had been waiting. Did any of them? She stopped. 2 we know of didn't make it home. His voice had gone flat in a particular way, the flatness of something being contained by will. The others, we're still working through it. The police will receive an anonymous delivery containing everything we found. He said it without apology. They'll get the credit. The families will get answers. That's what matters. Ilara looked at him. She thought about the 2 women who hadn't made it home, and she thought about the 11, and she thought about herself on that street with the fence and her legs failing and Martin behind her and no one watching, and she felt something move through her that was not grief and not rage, but some compound of both that didn't have a clean name. He was going to... She stopped again, made herself say it. He was going to do that to me. Yes. You're sure? Yes, she breathed. Okay, she said. Okay, he repeated, watching her. I'm not going to fall apart, she said, not defiantly, just informatively. I need you to know that. I'm processing this, but I'm not going to collapse on you. I didn't think you would. Most people would assume I'm not most people, he said. And you're not most people. I noticed that the first night. She looked at him. What did you notice? You were scared and you were losing the fight with whatever he gave you, and you still assessed the situation before you let me help you. He said it without inflation, just observed. Most people in that state take any hand that's offered. You checked first. She held his gaze. That got me almost killed. No, he said. That's what kept you alive long enough for it to matter. The silence between them changed. She could feel it change, something in the air of the room shifting its weight, moving toward something or away from something. She couldn't tell which. She pushed her plate back and looked at the window and the city beyond it. Then she looked back at him. Why are you doing this? She said. The food, the car, telling me in person instead of through Enzo. You could have sent me a message. You could have had someone call. Why is it you? Luca Moretti looked at Ilar Quinn for a long, considered moment. Because it should be, he said. Because you deserve to hear it from someone who gives a damn about what it cost you. She felt the sentence land somewhere deep and specific and tried not to let it show. Who was she? Ilara said quietly. The woman you mentioned. The one who didn't have anyone watching. His jaw set. My sister, he said. 14 years ago. She didn't say she was sorry. She'd never liked that reflex. The automatic apology for things that were not your fault and could not be your fault. The social cushioning that was more for the speaker's comfort than the listener's. She looked at him instead, steadily, and let the weight of it sit between them without trying to reduce it. She survived, Ilara said. She did. A pause. Differently. Ilara nodded. She knew what differently meant. She didn't need a glossary. Luca. She said his name, and it felt different out loud than it had in her head all day. More real, more weighted. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is complicated. Go ahead. Am I safe here? Not from Martin, not from outside, from this, from you, from whatever this is becoming. She met his eyes. Because I've been wrong about that before. About people. I spent a long time not trusting my own read on a situation, and I'm only recently starting to trust it again, and I need to know if this is something I should be walking away from. He didn't answer immediately. He didn't reach for an easy reassurance. He sat with the question the way you sat with something that mattered, giving it the weight it deserved. I'm not a safe person, he said finally. I don't do safe things. The way I live is not safe, and the people who orbit it are not safe. And I can't promise you that the city won't complicate whatever this is in ways neither of us can predict. He paused. What I can tell you is that I have never in my life lied to someone about what I am. I am what I am. And what I am is not a threat to you. She studied him. That's the most honest answer anyone has ever given me to that question, she said. Most people try to make themselves sound less than they are, he said. I've never seen the point. She was quiet for a moment. I lost a client yesterday, she said abruptly. He blinked. The subject shift seemed to catch him slightly off guard, which she suspected did not happen often. A freelance client, she continued. Small thing, $50 logo job. They went with someone on Fiverr for $12. She laughed once, short and humorless. I know that's nothing compared to what we were just talking about, but it's the accumulation of it. You know? It's the $11 and the $47 rent increase and the shifts Derek cuts and the agencies that don't call back and the $12 Fiverr logo and it all... She stopped, set her jaw. I'm fine. It's fine. Show me, Luca said. What? Your work. He gestured. You have your laptop? It's on my phone, my portfolio. He held out his hand. She looked at the hand. Then she unlocked her phone and opened her portfolio app and slid it across the island. He took it without ceremony and looked through it. She watched him look, not for approval, she told herself, but for the specific information of how someone who clearly had an eye for visual things responded to her work. He was methodical. He didn't perform interest. He stopped on certain pieces and looked longer and moved on without comment. She found herself watching his face with a focus that had nothing to do with professional anxiety and told herself to stop. When he was done, he set the phone down on the island, face up, open to a branding concept she'd done 8 months ago for a fictional hospitality company. Clean typography, a warm, restrained palette, a system that felt coherent without being predictable. He didn't say it was good. He said, I know someone who needs exactly this. He's been looking for 6 months, and nobody's given him something worth looking at. She stared at him. I'm not a charity case, she said immediately. I know. I'm not asking you to see. I'm not offering charity. His voice had an edge now, not hostile, just direct in a way that closed the distance between them fast. I'm saying your work is right for something I know about. That is a different thing. You can say no. She picked up her phone and looked at the piece he'd left it open to. She had spent 8 months on that concept. 8 months. In the margins of cafe shifts and late nights, and the 90 minutes of good morning light, building something she couldn't get anyone to see. Who is he? She said. A developer. He's converting a warehouse in Red Hook into a boutique hotel and event space. Mid-range, design-forward, trying not to look like every other conversion project in Brooklyn. Luca reached for his coffee. He has budget. He just hasn't found a designer with the right eye. And you think that's me? I think that's the piece you left open, he said. And I think you know it is too. She looked at him. The thing about Luca Moretti, she was beginning to understand, was that he didn't tell people what they wanted to hear. He told them what he saw. That was either his most disarming quality or his most dangerous one, and she was not yet certain which, and the uncertainty was its own kind of pull, a gravitational thing she could feel even as she cataloged it and tried to maintain a reasonable distance. Send me his contact information, she said. I'll make an introduction, he said. Monday. I said contact information. I'll reach out myself. A pause. Something that might have been the beginning of an argument decided against itself. Fine, he said. Monday. She nodded. She picked up her jacket and stood, and became aware suddenly of how late it was, 1 in the morning, pushing toward 1:30, and of the strangeness of the evening, of the food and the conversation, and the phone in his hand and the sister he'd mentioned, and the 11 women in Martin Hale's records, and how all of it had unspooled in this kitchen over the course of 2 hours with a man she'd met less than 48 hours ago. I should go, she said. Enzo will take you. I know. She paused at the edge of the kitchen. Luca! He looked up. Thank you, she said, for telling me in person. He held her gaze. You would have done the same, he said, if the positions were reversed. She didn't argue with that. She wasn't sure she could. She was at the elevator when his voice came from behind her, measured and low. Elara. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the kitchen, one hand on the island, looking at her with an expression that was as close to unguarded as she suspected his face got, something in it that was working to stay composed and not entirely winning. The developer's name is Ray Coletti, he said. His number will be in your messages by Monday morning. He's expecting your call. She hadn't given him permission to do that. He had done it anyway. And the terrible precise thing was, that the way he'd done it wasn't controlling. It wasn't the move of a man who collected women and managed their lives to keep them in reach. She'd been in the presence of that, and she knew its shape, and this wasn't it. This was a man who saw something true and moved toward it with the same directness he brought to everything else. And the difference between those two things was subtle enough that she could see how someone else might miss it, and wide enough that she could not. She went to the elevator. She got in. She pressed the lobby button and the doors slid closed, and she leaned against the back wall of the elevator car and looked at the ceiling for the 37 floors down and thought, with a clarity that felt like the edge of something she couldn't yet name. This is already further in than I planned. On Monday morning, Ray Coletti's number was in her messages. With it was a second message from Luca. 3 words, sent at 6:47 a.m. He's expecting you. She stared at it for a long time. Then she called Ray Coletti. The meeting was the following Wednesday in Red Hook. Elara arrived 15 minutes early, the way she always arrived, and stood outside the warehouse with her portfolio on her phone and the cold river wind off the harbor pressing against her jacket, and told herself this was just a client meeting, just another conversation, nothing to carry too much weight into. Ray Coletti was 50, broad, and direct in the way of men who had been building things for 30 years and had stopped performing patience. He shook her hand, led her through the warehouse space, raw concrete and structural steel and natural light in quantities that made her actually stop walking for a second, and sat her down at a folding table with 2 coffees and said, "Luca says you're the best designer nobody's heard of yet. Show me why." She showed him. 45 minutes later, he was leaning back in his chair with both hands behind his head, looking at the ceiling of his unfinished hotel, and he said, "Okay, what do you need to make this happen?" Elara Quinn sat very still for 3 full seconds. Then she told him. He said yes to all of it. She walked out of that warehouse into the Red Hook afternoon with a signed letter of intent in her email and a project fee that was larger than her last 8 months of freelance combined. And she stood on the sidewalk with the harbor wind on her face and her hands not entirely steady, and she thought, Luca did this. And then immediately, no. Ray Coletti did this because the work was right. Luca just opened the door. The distinction mattered. She held on to it. She texted Luca from the sidewalk. Coletti said yes. His response came in 40 seconds. I know. She almost smiled. She didn't. She put the phone in her pocket and walked to the subway and thought about what it meant to have a door opened by someone who expected nothing in return, and whether she believed that was actually what was happening, and whether the fact that she wanted to believe it was a warning or an answer. She was still thinking about it 3 weeks later when the things she'd been trying not to look at directly looked back at her. It happened in the kitchen of his penthouse, which had somehow become a place she spent Thursday evenings, a pattern that had established itself without being agreed upon. The way certain things established themselves when 2 people kept making the same decision without acknowledging they were making it. She cooked sometimes and he cooked other times, and they ate at the island and argued, which was what their conversations had become, precise and pointed and intellectually alive in a way she hadn't experienced in years, about design and cities and what made one neighborhood survive and another disappear, and what justice looked like when the official systems couldn't or wouldn't deliver it. That last one they always came back to. They never agreed on it completely. She respected him for not pretending they did. 3 weeks in, on a Thursday, she arrived to find him on the phone in the living room, standing at the window with his back to her, and whatever conversation he was having was not a friendly one. She could tell from the set of his shoulders alone, something was wrong, the kind of wrong that had weight and consequence and history behind it. She went to the kitchen and started coffee and did not eavesdrop. He came in 7 minutes later, put his phone face down on the counter, and stood with both hands flat on the marble looking at nothing. Talk to me, she said. He looked up. She could see it clearly now. Not fear, he didn't do fear, but something close to it in the operational sense. The tension of someone who had just received information that required a response he didn't yet have. One of Martin Hale's associates, he said. Someone we missed. Her stomach tightened. He knows about you, Luca said, that you were the one we intervened for, that it happened because of you specifically. He held her gaze and didn't soften it. He's been asking questions. What kind of questions? The kind people ask when they're deciding whether to do something. The kitchen was very quiet. So I'm not actually safe, she said. You are, he said, with a force that didn't quite manage to cover the edge beneath it. You will be. I'm handling it. Handling it, she said. Like you handled Martin. Yes. She looked at him. Luca. Her voice was steady. She needed it to be steady. How many people are going to disappear because of me? He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to hold his eyes. And he said with a quietness that was more emphatic than volume, "This has nothing to do with you. This is my world. This was always my world. You did not bring this, and you are not responsible for it, and I will not let you carry it." She held her ground. She didn't step back. "But I'm in it now," she said, "whether you intended that or not." A silence. "Yes," he said, "you are." The acknowledgement landed differently than she expected. She had thought she wanted him to argue, to tell her she wasn't implicated, that she could still step cleanly away, that this was manageable and finite and would resolve itself without touching her life. She'd thought the fear was the thing she was holding. But standing there in his kitchen with his eyes on her and the city laid out behind him, and the name of a man who was asking questions about her somewhere in the dark of it, what she found instead was that the fear had a floor, and past the floor was something else. Something that had been building for 3 weeks of Thursday evenings, and shared meals and arguments and silences, and the 8 months of work he'd seen in 5 minutes. She was in it. She had been in it before she'd known she was. And the only question now, the one that sat at the bottom of everything, the one neither of them had yet said out loud, was what that meant for both of them. Luca was still looking at her. She held his gaze. Neither of them moved. And in the charged, fragile quiet of that kitchen, 3 weeks and 2 lives past the point where walking away would have been the sensible thing, the distance between them narrowed to nothing, and his phone went off. He looked at the screen. Something in his face closed down fast and hard. "I have to go," he said. "What's happening?" He was already moving toward the door, already back in the other version of himself, the one that had stepped out of a black SUV in the rain and looked at a threat and already made its decision. "Stay here," he said. "Enzo is outside. Don't leave until I—" "Luca." Her voice cut through. "What is happening right now?" He stopped. He turned. He looked at her across the kitchen with an expression she had never seen on his face before, one that had something raw at the edges, something that hadn't finished being contained. "Martin Hale's associate," he said. "He's not asking questions anymore." Her blood ran cold. He's already here." The door closed behind Luca before the sentence finished. Alara stood in the kitchen for 3 full seconds, listening to the elevator mechanism engage, and then she moved. Not because she'd decided to, not because she'd weighed the options and arrived at a rational conclusion, but because standing still felt like something she could not afford. She went to the window. 37 floors below, the street in front of the building was quiet in the way that streets were quiet when they weren't. 2 black cars she didn't recognize were parked on the opposite side. A man on the corner was not looking at his phone with the specific, unconvincing posture of someone who was definitely looking at his phone. Another man by the building entrance, not Enzo, she knew Enzo's shape by now, was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face angled toward the door. She stepped back from the window. Her heart was doing something loud and unhelpful, and she registered it the way she'd registered the tilting sidewalk 3 weeks ago, with the part of her brain that cataloged threats before the emotional system had finished loading. And she breathed through it deliberately, 4 counts in, 4 out, the way she'd taught herself years ago during the bad stretch after the ex-boyfriend, during the months when the anxiety had physical dimensions. Her phone buzzed. "Luca. Stay away from the windows. Enzo is outside your door. Do not open it for anyone but him." She read it twice. Then she texted back, "There are men on the street. I saw them." His response took 40 seconds, which was 35 seconds longer than his usual response time, and when it came it was 2 words, "I know." She put the phone in her pocket and looked at the apartment around her, the apartment that was not hers, the penthouse that belonged to a man she'd known 3 weeks and whose world had just reached through the wall and grabbed her by the collar, and she thought with a clarity that cut straight through the fear. I am not going to be a person who waits in a room. She went to the front door and opened it. Enzo was there. He was leaning against the wall opposite with his arms crossed, and his face arranged in the particular blankness of a man who had done this before, who had stood outside doors in the middle of tense situations enough times that it had become just another configuration of his job. He looked at her and said nothing. Who is he? Alara said. The associate. Ma'am, don't. She held up one hand. Don't do that. Tell me who he is. Enzo looked at her for a moment with an expression that was assessing something, deciding something. His name is Danny Reese, Enzo said. He ran logistics for Hale's operation, procurement, transport. A pause. He knew where the bodies were. The phrase landed with physical weight. Literally, she said. Yes, she breathed. And he's here because of me. He's here because Mr. Moretti's people moved on Hale, Enzo said carefully. You were the inciting event. You weren't the cause. That distinction is very fine right now, she said. Enzo said nothing. She went back inside. She did not go to the window again. She sat on the gray sofa in the dark with the city lights doing their cold grid below and her hands clasped between her knees, and she thought about 11 women and 2 who hadn't made it home, and Danny Reese who knew where the bodies were and the sound of Luca's door closing on an unfinished sentence. She thought about Ray Coletti's warehouse and the signed letter of intent and the project fee and the 45 minutes that had shifted the gravity of her entire professional existence. She thought about Thursday evenings and arguments about cities and justice, and the way Luca looked at her work with the focused attention of someone who was actually seeing it, not performing the act of seeing it. She thought about this distance in his kitchen that had narrowed to nothing before his phone went off. She was still sitting there at 2:47 in the morning when she heard the elevator. The door opened. Luca came in and he was not physically damaged. She checked that first, automatic and immediate, and felt something loosen in her chest at the confirmation. But he was carrying the night on him the way you carried weight that hadn't resolved. His coat was off. His jacket was off. His shirt was intact and his hands were clean and his face was doing the contained thing she'd learned to read as the effort of keeping a great deal in a very small space. He saw her on the sofa and stopped. You were supposed to stay in the... I'm not in the bedroom, she said. I'm on the sofa. That's as much compliance as I had available. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Danny Reese, she said. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her. He leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, the same posture as their first real conversation, and he looked at her without the flatness she'd seen on the street, without the hard efficiency of the man who had made decisions all night. He looked at her the way he had in the kitchen before his phone went off. Is he handled? She said. Yes. And that's the end of it. A pause that lasted too long. We believe so. You believe so. She held his eyes. That's different from yes. There may be others in Hale's network we haven't fully mapped. We're working through it. He said it evenly. I'm not going to lie to you about the timeline. I know you're not. She unclenched her hands. That's the problem, actually. You're very honest about terrible things, and it makes it very hard to... She stopped. Hard to what? She looked at him. The room was dark except for the city light coming through the windows, and it did something to the lines of his face, made him look less like a man who ran things in this city and more like a man who was tired in a way that had accumulated over years, the kind of tired that had nothing to do with the hour. Hard to keep a sensible distance, she said. He was quiet. I'm not asking you to, he said finally. I know you're not. She looked at the window. That's the other problem. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Not uncomfortable, not easy, but present in the way of things that were real and couldn't be made smaller by ignoring them. She heard him breathe. She heard the building. She heard the city 37 floors below, doing what cities did at 3 in the morning, continuing its incomprehensible project of itself. Get some sleep, he said. The second bedroom. Luca. He stopped. She looked at him. I don't want the second bedroom, she said. The words sat between them, not a plea, not a performance, just a fact delivered the way he delivered facts, stripped down to the thing itself. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched his face do something she had not seen it do before. Not the controlled assessment, not the contained efficiency, but something that moved through it like weather, like something giving way. He stood up. He crossed the space between them. He sat beside her on the sofa, close, not touching, the distance of a question that hadn't been answered yet. And he looked at her in the dark with the city laid out behind him and said, "You should know what you're walking into." "I do know," she said. "No," he said, and his voice was quiet and direct and stripped of everything except the thing itself. "You know the surface of it. The surface is already significant, but there are depths to this life I haven't shown you because 3 weeks is not enough time and because some of it is not." He paused. "It's not easy to witness, even for people who are used to difficulty." "Are you trying to warn me off?" she said. "I'm trying to be honest with you." "Those aren't always different things," she said. He held her gaze. "No," he said. "They're not." She reached out and put her hand on his, and the contact was simple and deliberate, and she felt him go very still beneath it. Not the stillness of someone pulling away, but the stillness of someone who had not been touched like that in a long time and was processing it from somewhere deep. "I'll take the depths," she said. "That's what I'm telling you." He turned his hand over. And that was the night that something that had been careful and watched and navigated at a distance finally stopped, pretending it could stay that way. She stayed, not in the second bedroom. In the 3 weeks that followed, the world outside the penthouse continued to be the world outside the penthouse, which meant it was complicated and dangerous and full of things that did not resolve cleanly. Luca's people continued working through Hale's network. 2 more names surfaced, were dealt with, disappeared from the operational picture. Alara didn't ask for specifics, and Luca didn't offer them, which was an arrangement that worked because it was honest. She understood what she wasn't asking about and why, and he understood what she was trusting him with by not asking. She moved some of her things into the penthouse. Not all of them. Not formally. A drawer, which became 2 drawers, which became a section of the closet and a corner of his office for her design setup. The shift happened gradually and then obviously, and neither of them declared it, which was how both of them preferred it. Not a negotiation, just a series of true things accumulating. The Coletti project consumed her. She worked on it with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting years for exactly this. The right space, the right client, the right scale. She was in Red Hook 3 mornings a week looking at raw concrete and measuring sight lines and arguing with Ray Coletti about palette decisions with a confidence she hadn't known she had until it was needed. Coletti, who had spent 30 years being argued with by people who didn't know what they were talking about, seemed to find her arguments worth having. He told Luca, "She's the real thing." Luca told Alara. Alara filed it away and kept working. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday. She was in the penthouse office at 7 in the evening with her laptop and her Red Hook files spread across the desk when she heard Luca come in from whatever the day had been. She could tell from the weight of his footsteps. She'd learned his footsteps, which was the kind of intimate and inadvertent knowledge that accumulated when you shared space with someone, and she'd stopped being unsettled by it, that something was off. She came out of the office. He was standing in the kitchen with a glass of water, and he was looking at the counter with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not contained tension. Something older than that. Something with history in it. "What happened?" she said. He looked up. He assessed her for half a second in the way he sometimes did before deciding how much to say. "A man named Victor Rael reached out today," he said. She crossed the kitchen and sat at the island. "Who is he?" "He runs distribution on the east side. We've had an arrangement for several years." He set down the glass. "He wanted to renegotiate terms." "And that's unusual?" "The terms we have don't get renegotiated," he said. "That's the point of them." She looked at him. "What does he actually want?" A pause. "He wants assurance," Luca said, "that recent events haven't destabilized my operation, that what happened with Hale and Reese was contained." "Recent events," she repeated. "Meaning me. Meaning the action we took." "Yes." She absorbed that. "He thinks you're exposed. He thinks I made a decision that was personal rather than strategic." His jaw was tight. "He's not entirely wrong about that." She looked at him carefully. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that the fact that you helped me, that the reason you were on that street is being used by someone in your world to argue that you're compromised?" He met her gaze. Yes, he said. The silence in the kitchen was different from the silences they'd built over weeks of Thursday evenings. This one had edges. And what does that mean for you? She said. Practically. What does Victor Rael do if he decides you're compromised? He tests it, Luca said. He makes a move that would previously have been off the table, and he watches the response. A move against what? Luca didn't answer immediately. Luca. Her voice went flat. Against what? Against anything that would establish leverage, he said. Assets, operations, or people who matter to me. The last 4 words arrived with full weight and stayed. She put her hands flat on the island. She thought about 11 women and Danny Reese and Enzo outside the door, and Victor Rael deciding whether to test a theory. I'm the leverage, she said. I'm what he'd move against. I will not let that happen. I know you believe that. She looked at him. But that's not what I asked. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. Potentially. She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there for a long moment looking out at the city that had never noticed her until one rainy midnight when it suddenly noticed her very much. She thought about this $47 rent increase and the $11 and the freelance jobs that paid late. And she thought about Ray Coletti's warehouse and the drawer and the 2 drawers and the section of closet, and she thought about what it meant to have walked into something without fully mapping the architecture of it, which she had done knowingly and which she did not regret, and which had nonetheless brought her here. Standing at a floor-to-ceiling window on the 37th floor, knowing that a man she'd never met was calculating whether destroying her was a viable strategy. She turned back to the room. What did you tell Rael? That the terms stand, Luca said, that his concern was noted and unwarranted. Did he believe you? A pause that was its own answer. No, she said. He didn't. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of Luca and looked at him with the deliberate steadiness she used when she needed to know if what she was seeing was what was actually there. Is there something you haven't told me, she said, about the scope of this, about Rael or the others who've been reassessing you since Hale? He held her gaze. There's something I should have told you sooner, he said. I was waiting until it was resolved. The cold came back. Tell me now, she said. He reached into his jacket and put a photograph on the island counter between them. She looked at it. It was a photo of her. Not a surveillance photo, nothing grainy or long-lensed. A clear photograph taken from a moderate distance in the Red Hook neighborhood outside the Coletti warehouse. She was walking toward the entrance with her portfolio bag and her coffee and her jacket, and she was not looking at the camera. The photograph was recent, maybe 2 weeks ago. She looked at it for a long moment. Where did this come from, she said. It was sent to me, Luca said, 3 days ago. No message, just this. Someone is watching me. She heard the flatness in her own voice. Someone followed me to the Coletti project. Yes, and you've known for 3 days. I've been tracing the origin. I didn't want to alarm you without knowing. Luca! The word came out with an edge she hadn't used with him before. You have known for 3 days that someone sent you a photograph of me and you said nothing. I was handling it. Stop saying that. She took a breath, kept her voice level because the alternative was something she wasn't ready to be in this kitchen. Stop saying you're handling it and tell me what the actual situation is. All of it. Not the version where you've decided what I can manage. His jaw was tight. The photo came from someone inside my own organization, he said. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Inside, she said. Yes. Someone who works for you sent you a photograph of me. Yes. As what? A threat? A warning? We don't know yet. He held her gaze and she could see the cost of saying the next part. We have 2 possibilities. The first is that someone inside is feeding information to Rael, documenting your involvement in my life to build a case for his argument that I'm compromised. The second possibility, he stopped. Say it. The second possibility is that someone inside the organization was connected to Hale's network in ways we haven't fully uncovered, and that photograph was sent to me as a message, to tell me they know where you are, what you mean to me. Alara Quinn stood in Luca Moretti's kitchen at 7:30 on a Tuesday evening and felt the floor of the situation drop out. Not the fear, She'd been afraid before. She knew the shape of fear and she knew how to carry it, and she could carry it again. What she felt was something different, something that had to do with the accumulation of it. 3 weeks of Thursdays and Red Hook mornings, and the drawer and the section of closet, and the conversation on the sofa, the hand turned over, the choice she'd made with full information, and now the information had changed. She picked up the photograph. She looked at herself in it, walking toward a building, not knowing, not seeing. She set it down. Someone inside your organization, she said carefully, has been documenting me, and maybe connected to the network that wanted to hurt me in the first place. She looked at him. Which means you have a traitor, and they're using me to find the edges of you. Luca said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because she had just described the situation exactly. She looked at him for a long time. This isn't sustainable, she said. Alara? I'm not leaving, she said immediately, and the clarity of it surprised even her. I'm not saying that. I'm saying this. The way you've been managing information, deciding what I know and when I know it, handling things and telling me after, that is not sustainable. Not for me. She held his gaze. If I'm going to be in this world with you, I need to be actually in it, not protected from it, because the protection has a cost, and the cost is that I walk around not knowing that someone is photographing me outside my client's building. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before on his face. It was something close to exposed. If I show you everything, he said slowly, you may not want what you're looking at. I know, she said. That's my risk to take. A long silence. There's more, he said. Her stomach tightened. Then tell me. He reached into his jacket again and put a second photograph on the counter. This one was not of Alara. It was of Luca, taken from inside the penthouse building, from the lobby, at close range, with a date stamp from 4 days ago. Whoever had taken it had been inside his building, inside his security, inside the circle of people he trusted to keep the perimeter. Alara looked at the photograph. She looked at the date. She looked at Luca's face and found it stripped of everything, the efficiency and the containment and the hard, practiced composure, all of it gone, replaced by something raw and furious, and underneath the fury, something that was almost grief. Because he understood what the photograph meant. The traitor wasn't feeding information to Rael. The traitor wasn't connected to Hale's network. The traitor was someone who had been close enough, trusted enough, to walk into the lobby of this building and take a photograph of Luca Moretti from 20 feet away and send it to him as a message. Because the message wasn't about Alara. The message was, I can reach you. Who is it? She said. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the answer before he said it. The specific devastation of a betrayal that could only come from proximity, from someone whose access was built on years of trust, on the particular faith you extended to the people who stood closest to the things that mattered most. Marco, he said. She stared at him. You're second, she said. The man who's been with you for 11 years, Luca said. The word fell like a door closing on 11 years, Luca said. The word fell like a door closing on everything that had existed before it. Alara stood at the kitchen island with the 2 photographs between them and watched Luca Moretti do something she had not seen him do in 6 weeks of knowing him. She watched him absorb a blow, not physically. Nothing moved, nothing changed in the surface arrangement of him. But somewhere beneath the stillness, something was taking the impact, processing the specific weight of 11 years being rewritten in a single revelation. And she could see it in the way his hands went flat on the counter and stayed there, pressing down like he needed to feel something solid. She didn't speak. She let him have the 30 seconds. Then he picked up both photographs and put them in his jacket pocket, and his face closed back down into the operational version of itself, and he said, I need to make a call. Luca. He stopped. Don't go after him tonight, she said. Not like this. Not when it's personal. He looked at her with eyes that were flat and dark and doing their own kind of damage control. It's always personal, he said. No, she said. It's usually strategic. This is different, and you know it's different, and that's exactly why you shouldn't move until you've... Alara. His voice was quiet and final. I know what I'm doing. She held his gaze. I know you do, she said. I'm asking you to also know what you're feeling. Something crossed his face. Fast, and then gone. He left. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after the elevator doors closed. Then she picked up her phone and texted Enzo. "Where's he going?" Enzo's response came in 20 seconds. "Better you don't know tonight." She put the phone down. She was wrong about one thing. Luca did not move that night. Whatever the call was, whatever he learned, he came back at 2 in the morning and came to bed without speaking and lay in the dark beside her with his jaw set and his eyes open for a long time before sleep took him, and she lay beside him and listened to the city and the building and the specific quality of a silence that was full of things being held back, and she did not push. She waited. She had learned in 6 weeks that with Luca Moretti, patience was not passivity. It was strategy. He told her in the morning. They were at the kitchen island with coffee and the physical newspaper and the particular quality of early light that came through the east-facing windows and made the marble counters look warm, almost domestic, and he set down his mug and looked at her and said, "Marco has been talking to Victor Rael for 4 months. She set down her own mug. 4 months, she said, before Hale. Before me. Before any of it. His voice was even. He's been building a case, documenting operational decisions, financial flows, the structure of arrangements I have with people up and down the east side. He looked at the counter. He's been building Rael a blueprint of everything I built. Why? Rael offered him a position when the transition is complete. He said it the way you said things you had fully processed and whose emotional content you had decided not to revisit in the saying. Marco has been running my second chair for 11 years. He knows everything, every alliance, every arrangement, every person who owes me, and every person I owe. A pause. With that information, Rael doesn't need to fight me. He just has to wait until the people around me believe I'm finished. Elara thought about Victor Rael deciding Luca was compromised, about the photograph of her outside the Coletti building, about the photograph of Luca in his own lobby. The photographs, she said. Marco sent them. Yes. Not as a threat, as a demonstration. She worked through it. He was showing Rael what he had access to. Proof of delivery. Luca looked at her. Yes, he said. And he sent them to you because he wanted me to know, Luca said. That's the part that took me until 3 this morning to understand. Something moved in his face. Marco isn't doing this because he wants to destroy me. He's doing it because he wants me to see it coming. He's giving me the chance to... He stopped. To what? She said quietly. To step back, Luca said, voluntarily, to recognize that Rael has the position and the momentum and that fighting it costs more than surrendering it. The kitchen was very quiet. He thinks he's doing you a favor, she said. He thinks he's saving my life, Luca said. In his calculation, this is mercy. She looked at him. Is he wrong? She said. The question cost her something to ask. She asked it anyway. Luca picked up his mug. He looked at the window. He looked at the city that he had spent 20 years building a particular relationship with, not ownership exactly, not the clean legal kind, but the kind of authority that existed in the spaces between official structures, in the arrangements that didn't have paperwork, in the knowledge of what moved and where and why. He's wrong about what I'll accept, Luca said. He may not be wrong about the cost. She absorbed that. What do you need? She said. He looked at her. From me, she said. Right now. What do you need? He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously and keeping all of them controlled. I need you to be somewhere safe while I end this, he said. That's not what I offered. Elara. I'm not going to a safe house or a second location or wherever Enzo takes people when the situation requires it. She held his gaze. I'm not leaving you alone with this. You don't have a role in what comes next. Then what is my role? She said. In this? Whatever this is. What exactly is my function when things get to this level? Because I'm not an accessory, and I'm not a liability, and I'm not the woman you put somewhere protected while you handle it. She set her mug down. I'm the person who is in this with you. That's what you said. That's what we said. He was quiet. Then be here when it's done, he said. That's what I need. Be here when I come back. She looked at him for a long time. Okay, she said, but I need something in return. Name it. Tell me the plan, she said. All of it, not a summary. Not the version where you've decided what I can handle. The actual plan, he told her. It took 20 minutes and 2 more coffees, and she sat and listened without interrupting. And by the end of it, she understood several things she had not understood before about the architecture of the world Luca Moretti operated in, about the specific mechanics of how a man like Victor Rael moved and what he valued and what he feared, and about what it cost to dismantle 11 years of trust in a way that was final and unambiguous and left no useful doubt behind. She understood why he needed to do it in person. She understood why Marco had to be present. She hated both of those things, and she said nothing about either of them. What she said was, "Marco doesn't know that you know." "No," Luca said. "He thinks you're still in the dark, still deciding whether the photographs are a warning or a threat." "He'll find out today," Luca said. "I'm calling a meeting." "He'll run." "He won't run." Luca's voice had gone to its flattest register. "Marco has been with me 11 years. He'll want to explain. He'll think he can." A pause. "He believes the mercy narrative. He'll want to deliver it in person." She thought about that. "That's the most dangerous part," she said, "when someone believes they're right." Luca looked at her. "Yes," he said. "It is." He left at noon. The hours between noon and 7 in the evening were the longest of Alara Quinn's adult life, and she had spent significant portions of her adult life waiting for things that didn't arrive on schedule. She worked. She opened the Coletti files and stared at them and moved things around without conviction and closed them. She made lunch and ate half of it. She walked through the penthouse the way she'd walked through it the first morning, looking at the art on the walls and the books on the coffee table and the knife block in the kitchen with the useware on the handles, and she thought about what it meant to have learned a person through the objects they chose and the way they occupied space. And she thought about the drawer in the section of closet and what it meant that she'd left those things here instead of taking them when she'd had the practical opportunity. She knew what it meant. She'd known for 2 weeks what it meant. She was still knowing it when her phone buzzed at 4:50 with a text from an unknown number. "He's not going to let Marco talk. Tell him to let Marco talk. There's something he doesn't know." She stared at the message. She called Luca. No answer. She tried again. Still no answer, which meant he was already in the meeting, already in the room, already across the table from the man who had spent 4 months building a case for his obsolescence. She texted Enzo. "Someone just sent me this. Unknown number." She forwarded the message. "Do you know what this means?" Enzo's response, "Where are you right now? Penthouse. Why?" A pause that lasted 90 seconds, which was 75 seconds longer than Enzo usually took. "Stay there. Lock the door. I'm sending someone up." She felt the cold arrive in her chest before she finished reading it. She went to the front door and locked it. She stood in the entryway with her back against the wall beside the door and her phone in her hand, and she listened. The building was quiet. The elevator was at lobby level, according to the display panel beside the door. Nothing was moving. She told herself to breathe. She breathed. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. "I said tell him to let Marco talk. There's a second player. Rael has someone inside who isn't Marco. Marco found out. That's why he sent the photographs. He was trying to warn Luca, not threaten him." The floor of the situation dropped out again. She read the message 3 times. Marco hadn't been building a case for Rael. Marco had discovered Rael's actual asset, someone else, someone closer, someone still unidentified. And the photographs had been his way of telling Luca without being able to say it directly. Without being able to say, "I know there's a traitor, but I can't tell you who without revealing how I know. Without revealing that I've been close enough to Rael to have access to his operation. Without revealing the years of my own compromised position that I've spent trying to locate this person before they could be used against you." Mercy. Marco had called it mercy. It wasn't mercy. It was a man who had been playing both sides for 4 months, trying to locate a knife before it found Luca's back. She called Luca again. Nothing. She called Enzo. He picked up on the first ring and she said immediately, "The second message, did you read it?" "Yes." His voice was tight. "I'm trying to reach Mr. Moretti." "Where is the meeting?" "Ma'am?" "Enzo. Where is the meeting?" A pause. "A warehouse in Greenpoint," he said. 43rd and send me the address." I cannot put you in a vehicle and send you to. Send me the address, or I take a cab and I don't know the address, and I end up looking for a warehouse in Greenpoint in the dark, she said. Which is worse? 3 seconds. The address came through. She grabbed her jacket. The cab took 19 minutes in traffic that felt like drowning in slow motion. She sat in the back with her hands in her lap and her phone on the seat beside her, and she watched the city go past and thought about Luca in a room with Marco, delivering the verdict of 11 years of trust betrayed, not knowing that the verdict was wrong, not knowing that the knife was still in the room, and it wasn't in Marco's hand. The warehouse district in Greenpoint at 6 in the evening was the color of rust and industrial exhaust, all corrugated metal and chain link, and the particular bleakness of spaces designed for function and nothing else. The cab dropped her half a block from the address, and she walked the rest, which was how she saw the second car. Not Luca's cars, not the black sedans she knew. A gray panel van parked at an angle that blocked the warehouse's side exit, engine off but recently run. She could see the heat shimmer off the hood. A man she didn't recognize standing at the warehouse's main entrance with his hands visible and his attention split between the door and the street, watching both, keeping both. She stopped walking. She pulled out her phone and texted the unknown number. I'm outside. Who are you? The response came in 10 seconds. Don't go in the front. There's a loading door on the east side. It's unlocked. Go now, before Santos sees you. Santos. The man at the front. Rael's man. She looked at the east side of the warehouse, a rolling loading door partially raised, throwing a bar of yellow interior light across the cracked concrete. She moved. She went low and fast along the building's exterior, keeping to the shadows of the overhang, and she reached the loading door and ducked under it and came up inside into the smell of concrete dust and machine oil, and the specific still air of a large interior space that had been occupied recently by people doing tense things. She heard voices, not shouting, not yet. The controlled, deliberate cadence of a confrontation that was still in its formal stages, still observing the grammar of how these things went before the grammar stopped mattering. She moved toward the sound. The warehouse interior was partitioned by rows of metal shelving, mostly empty, and she moved between them with her sneakers silent on the concrete and her heartbeat doing something loud and irregular in her ears that she breathed against systematically. 4 counts, 4 counts, keep it down, keep it functional. She came to the edge of the last row of shelving and looked through the gap. Luca was standing at a metal table in the center of a cleared space, and he was not alone. Marco was across from him, late 40s, solid, a face that had absorbed a lot of weather and showed it, with the specific stillness of someone who had made peace with an outcome. 2 of Luca's men flanked the space. The overhead lights were industrial and merciless and threw everything in sharp relief. Luca was speaking. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the posture, controlled, precise, the posture of a verdict being delivered, of something being ended with full deliberation. Marco's hands were on the table, flat and open, the posture of a man who was not going to fight. She looked at the perimeter of the space and found what she was looking for in the far corner, half concealed by shadow and the angle of the shelving. A third figure, not one of Luca's men, not positioned with them, positioned apart, watching. One hand inside his jacket. Rael's real asset, not here to witness, here to act. Waiting for the moment when Luca's attention was fully on Marco, fully on the 11-year verdict, to move. She looked at her phone. She had no way to signal Luca without the figure in the corner seeing the movement. She looked at Marco and thought about the photographs and the word mercy, and what it cost a man to spend 4 months in the proximity of something rotting in order to find the source of the rot. Marco was looking at Luca's hands on the table. He was not looking at the corner. She found Enzo's number and typed with her thumbs, shaking slightly from adrenaline, not fear, she told herself. Purely adrenaline. Corner of the warehouse, far right from Luca. Rael's man. Gun. She hit send. She watched the figure in the corner shift his weight. She watched Luca's shoulders set for the end of the verdict. She watched Marco's face do something she wasn't expecting. Not resignation, not the performance of a man accepting judgment, but urgency. A sudden attempt to speak, to interrupt. A hand coming up off the table. And the figure in the corner drew. Everything happened in the space of 2 seconds that felt stretched to their absolute limit. She screamed Luca's name. Not a word. A sound, pure and full volume, everything she had, launched into the acoustics of the warehouse so it hit every surface simultaneously. Luca moved, not away from the table, sideways, dropping his shoulder, the instinctive geometric response of a man who had spent years in rooms where things moved fast, and the shot went past where he'd been standing and hit the metal shelving 10 feet beyond with a sound like something tearing. Marco was already moving around the table. Luca's men converged on the corner. The figure with the gun had time for one recalculation and made the wrong one. He went for a second shot instead of the exit, which told her everything about whether Rael had given him a contingency, and then Luca's men were on him, and the calculation became irrelevant. Silence. The kind that followed violence. Not peaceful, just the absence of the specific sounds that had just been present, a negative space where gunshot and movement and shouting had been. Luca straightened. He turned. He found her at the edge of the shelving row, and the look on his face in the industrial light was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on it. Not relief, not anger, not the closed operational face, but something that crossed all of it simultaneously, something that started in the chest and didn't know where to put itself. He crossed the warehouse floor in 10 strides. He stopped in front of her and took her face in both hands and looked at her with an intensity that was beyond assessment, beyond the clinical readiness she'd first seen on a rainy street. This was the look of someone who had just understood the value of something in the specific way you understood value when it almost ceased to exist. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." Her voice was steadier than she expected. "You were supposed to be at the penthouse. You were supposed to answer your phone." A sound came out of him that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. Behind him, Marco stood at the table with his hands still flat on the surface, and he was looking at Alara with an expression she couldn't fully read. Recognition, she thought. The specific recognition of someone seeing the thing that changed the calculation. "Luca," she said. "I know," he said. He hadn't let go of her face. "He was trying to warn you. The photographs—" "I know." His thumbs against her jaw were not gentle and not rough, just present. Just real. "Enzo reached me 30 seconds before you screamed." 30 seconds is— "I know what 30 seconds is," he said quietly. "I know exactly what 30 seconds is." She looked at him. She put her hands over his on her face and held them there. Behind them, Marco said, "I'm sorry." His voice was flat with exhaustion and something that had been carried too long. "I should have found another way to tell you." Luca didn't turn around immediately. He looked at Alara for another moment, looked at her the way you looked at something you had just almost lost and were still processing the reality of not having lost. And then he lowered his hands and turned. "You should have," he said to Marco. His voice was not forgiving and it was not unforgiving. It was something more complicated than either, the voice of a man who had just had 11 years recontextualized in the space of 40 minutes. "We're going to have a long conversation about what you should have done." "Yes?" Marco said. "Not tonight." "No," Marco agreed. Luca looked at the man in the corner, now restrained, now the property of a situation that was going to resolve itself in ways that had nothing to do with Rael's planning. He looked at him with a flatness that was total and final. And then he looked away because the looking away was also a decision, also an exercise of authority, the authority to not dignify something with sustained attention. He turned back to Alara. "We need to deal with Rael," he said. "Tonight? Before morning," he said, while he still thinks his asset is in position. He looked at her steadily. "I need you to go back to the penthouse." She started to speak. "Not for your safety," he said. "I need you there because what comes next in the next 3 hours is going to determine whether this ends or whether it continues, and I cannot do what needs to be done if I am thinking about where you are." He held her gaze. "That is not me managing you. That is me telling you the truth about my own limitations." She held his gaze. She thought about the acknowledgement in it, the specific honesty of a man who had just told her that she was the thing that divided his attention, that her presence in the perimeter of a situation cost him operational clarity, that she had become, in 6 weeks of Thursdays and shared kitchens and one drawer become 2, the thing he couldn't fully separate from the calculus of every decision. She understood what that cost him to say. She understood what it meant that he'd said it. Okay, she said. Enzo. I know, she said. Enzo takes me. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he did something she was not expecting. He pulled her in and held her. Not a movie embrace, not a performance, just his arms around her and her face against his shoulder for exactly 5 seconds. And she felt the tension in his chest, the controlled force of everything that had been running at high capacity for 16 hours, finally acknowledging its own weight, and she put her hands flat against his back and held on. 5 seconds. Then he let go. He turned back to the warehouse and the work of it. She walked to the loading door. She ducked under it into the Greenpoint night. She got into Enzo's car, which was already there, already running. She sat in the back and watched the warehouse recede through the rear window, and she thought about Victor Rael in some other location in this city, believing his move had landed, believing the night was going the direction he'd planned it, not yet knowing that the thing he'd sent into that warehouse had failed, and that the man he'd spent 4 months trying to dismantle was right now turning the full weight of 20 years of authority toward the task of ending him. She thought about what Luca had said. I cannot do what needs to be done if I am thinking about where you are. She thought about the 5 seconds. She looked at her hands in her lap. They had stopped shaking. The car moved through the city. Somewhere behind her, in the direction of Greenpoint, Luca Moretti picked up his phone and made the call that, somewhere behind her, in the direction of Greenpoint, Luca Moretti picked up his phone and made the call that ended Victor Rael's ambitions in the span of 45 minutes. Alara didn't know the details. She had asked not to know them, which was its own kind of understanding. The understanding that there were mechanics to the world Luca operated in that she could live alongside without needing to witness directly, and that the line between those two positions was one she had drawn herself and intended to hold. What she knew was this. At 11:17 that night, Luca came through the penthouse door, and he was whole, and he was tired in a way that went past the physical, and he stood in the entryway for a moment just looking at her on the sofa with the lamp on, and her Coletti files spread across the coffee table, and something in his face settled. Not relief. Something quieter than relief. The specific stillness of a man who had been carrying a sustained weight and had just set it down. It's done, he said. Rael. Yes. She looked at him. Marco. He came into the room and sat in the chair across from her. The same chair, the same posture as the first night, forearms on knees, looking at her directly. Marco is alive. He'll stay that way. A pause. We have a great deal to work through. He made choices I can't fully forgive, and I don't intend to pretend otherwise. But he spent 4 months inside something dangerous trying to find the knife before it landed. His jaw set. That counts for something. I don't know yet how much. She nodded. The man in the corner, she said. Gone. She absorbed that without comment. And it's actually finished, she said. Not, we believe so. Actually finished. He held her gaze. Rael had 2 people he trusted with the full architecture of what he was building. Both are gone. His organization doesn't have the infrastructure to make another move without a year of reconstruction minimum. By then, the arrangements will have shifted and the moment will have passed. He looked at her steadily. It's finished. She looked at him for a long time. Then she closed the Coletti files and set them aside and said, Come here. He crossed to the sofa and sat beside her, and she leaned into him the way she'd leaned exactly once before, in a warehouse in Greenpoint for 5 seconds. And this time there was no count, no operational timeline, no reason to let go on a schedule. His arm came around her, and she felt the exhale move through him, deep, long, the kind of exhale that had been held through hours of precision and pressure, and the specific cost of making decisions that were final. They stayed like that for a while. The city did its patient, indifferent work outside the windows. She was the one who moved first, pulling back enough to look at him, and she said, I need to tell you something. He looked at her. In the warehouse, she said. When I saw Rael's man in the corner, I was scared. She held his eyes. I've been scared before. That's not what I mean. I was scared in the specific way where I understood that if I didn't do something, you were going to get hurt, and there was no one else positioned to do it, and I did it, and I'm okay with that. She paused. I'm okay with being the person who does that. I need you to know that. Because I think you're going to spend some time trying to reconfigure this so that I'm never in that position again. And I need you to know it's not necessary. He was looking at her with the careful attention he gave things that mattered. I heard you scream my name, he said quietly. I didn't know where you were. I didn't know how close you were to... He stopped. I know, she said. I'm not reconfiguring anything, he said. I'm just telling you what it was like. She held his gaze. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They stayed there until past midnight, and then they went to bed and slept the sleep of people who had been running at maximum capacity and had finally found the floor of it. And in the morning, the city was still there, unchanged and indifferent, doing what cities do. 3 days later, Alara went back to Red Hook. She stood inside the Coletti warehouse in the morning light and looked at the raw concrete and the steel beams and the quality of the natural light through the north-facing industrial windows. And she breathed in the dust and the cold river air that came through the gaps in the structure, and she thought, this place is going to be something. This place already is something. It just doesn't know its own name yet. That was her job. She worked. The weeks that followed had a different texture from the weeks before. Not easier exactly, not less complicated, but more honest. The architecture of what she and Luca were to each other had been tested in the specific way that only crisis could test it, and what had come out the other side was not damaged, but clarified. She knew things about him now that she hadn't known when she'd been keeping a sensible distance, things that had no equivalent in the Thursday evening version of their life together. She knew how he moved in a room when the stakes were absolute. She knew what his face did when something cost him. She knew the sound of his exhale when he finally set a weight down. She knew he had carried the memory of his sister for 14 years like a stone in his chest, and she knew that the night on the street in Hell's Kitchen hadn't been strategy or coincidence. It had been him doing in practice what he'd spent 14 years doing in principle, watching the spaces the city didn't watch. She knew that was never going to stop being who he was. She had decided that was fine, more than fine. She had decided that the impulse to protect, in a man who understood the difference between protection and possession, was not a flaw to be managed. It was just a part of him. Like the cooking and the philosophy books, and the directness that stripped every conversation down to the thing itself. She told him this on a Thursday evening in November, 6 weeks after Greenpoint, while they were eating something he'd made with winter vegetables and short ribs, and she was sitting at the island with her sketch pad because she'd had an idea on the subway home and needed to get it down before it evaporated. And he'd watched her sketch for 20 minutes without interrupting and put a plate in front of her without being asked. She looked up from the sketch pad and looked at him and said, "You know I love you." He put down his fork. He looked at her with an expression that moved through several things quickly and arrived somewhere unguarded. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying it because I want you to say it back," she said. "I'm saying it because I've been carrying it for a while, and the carrying is less efficient than the saying." Something happened in his face then, not the shift she'd learned to read as things being contained. The opposite, something releasing, opening. "Alara," he said, "you don't have to." "I love you," he said, simply, without ornament or qualification. The way he delivered every true thing, stripped down, direct, with no protective cushioning around it. "I have for a long time. I didn't say it because I was waiting until the world I live in had finished trying to make it complicated." She looked at him. "Has it finished?" A pause. "It's quieter," he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere genuine, and he watched it happen with the expression of a man who was still slightly amazed that laughter could occur in his vicinity. "Quieter is good," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She turned back to her sketch pad. He turned back to his plate, and in the quiet of the kitchen, under the warm light, the city doing its endless patient work beyond the windows, something that had been building for months settled into its final shape. Not dramatic, not announced, just present. A life. Chosen, not fallen into. The Coletti project launched in February. The opening was on a Thursday, which was either coincidence or the universe being economical with its symbols. And Alara stood in the main reception space of what had been raw concrete and industrial steel 4 months ago, and was now something warm and specific and alive with the particular energy of a space that knew what it was. The palette she'd built, warm terracotta and aged brass, and a deep, honest gray that she'd spent 3 weeks arriving at, moved through the space with the coherence of something that had been thought through at every scale, from the large gesture of the wall treatments to the small decisions of the door hardware. Ray Coletti stood beside her with a glass of something and looked at the full room and said, "You made this." "We made this," she said. "I provided the building," he said. "You made it mean something." She held her glass and looked at the room and thought about 18 agencies and $50 jobs that went to $12 alternatives and $11.40 and the landlord's polite apologetic message about the rent increase. And she thought about the night she'd been too tired and too defeated to listen to the alarm in her body, and she thought about what it cost and what it gave and whether she would change any of it, given the option. She would not. Not one decision. Not one night. Luca arrived late because he was always arriving to things late, which she'd accepted as a structural feature of his existence rather than a deficiency of manners, and he came in through the main entrance and stood at the edge of the reception space and looked at it, really looked, the focused, deliberate look he gave things that mattered. And then he found her across the room and walked to her with the direct, unhurried purpose of a man who had somewhere specific to be and knew it. He stood beside her and looked at the room. "You did this," he said. "Everyone keeps saying that," she said, "because it's true." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the room with something she recognized now as pride. Not his own pride in his own work, but the rare and more particular pride you felt for someone else's. The pride of having seen something true early and been right about it. "I said you were the best designer nobody had heard of yet." "You said that to Ray Coletti," she said. "I meant it." She looked at him. He was still looking at the room. She looked at his profile in the warm light, the sharp bones and dark eyes and the face that had never needed to be anything other than what it was. And she thought about a rainy street in Hell's Kitchen and the question, "Can you walk?" and the fact that the honest answer had been no, and what it meant that she'd said so. "Come up to the roof," she said. "I want to show you something." He looked at her. "Now?" "The party will survive 5 minutes without us," she said. They took the elevator to the top floor and a staircase from there to the roof access, which Alara had specified as a guest space and which was currently unoccupied, the party not having spread this far yet. She pushed through the door and the February air hit them both, cold and direct and smelling of the harbor, and the rooftop opened up before them with the Brooklyn skyline and the distant shine of Manhattan across the water. She had designed this space too. She stood at the railing and looked at it. The low planters that would be green in spring, the lighting she'd specified to throw warm pools rather than flood the whole surface, the eastern railing left deliberately open to maximize the view, and she felt the specific satisfaction of a person looking at something they made and finding it honest. Luca stood beside her at the railing. Below them, through the floor, they could hear the muffled energy of the opening, music, voices, the accumulation of a room full of people discovering a space for the first time. "You've been carrying something," Luca said. She looked at him. "For the last 2 weeks," he said. "I've been waiting for you to say it." She looked back at the view. Manhattan glittered across the water, patient and impersonal and full of 10,000 versions of 10,000 lives, all of them proceeding simultaneously in the dark. "I've been thinking about gratitude," she said. He was quiet. "About whether what I feel for you started as gratitude and whether I can actually distinguish between the two," she said. "Whether any of this, the way I feel, the choices I made, the drawer and the closet and the—" She stopped, breathed. "Whether I would have made any of it if you hadn't been the person who was there that night." Luca turned slightly to look at her. "That's what you've been carrying," he said. "Yes." "For 2 weeks." "On and off," she said. "I know it's not nothing," he said. Not dismissively, not to shut it down. The voice of someone taking a question seriously. "It's not a small thing to ask." "No," she said. "It's not." He turned to face the view again. He put both hands on the railing and looked at Manhattan the way he sometimes looked at the city, with the specific attention of a man who had spent 20 years learning its weight and had never stopped being affected by it. "I can't answer that for you," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to." "What I can tell you," he said, is that gratitude and love are not mutually exclusive, that the first one doesn't cancel the second one, that you can be grateful to someone for something real and also love them for everything they are independent of that thing. He paused. Those can live in the same place, in a person. That's not corruption. That's just how it works. She was quiet for a moment. I know that, she said. I know it intellectually. But you needed to say it out loud. Yes. Okay, he said. You said it. She looked at him. That's it, she said. What else is there? He turned to look at her, and his face in the cold February air was open in the way it had become open over months of Thursday evenings and kitchens and crisis and the slow accumulation of a person being seen. You've been carrying a question. The question is fair. I don't have a clean answer because clean answers to real questions are usually wrong. What I have is this. He looked at her directly, no performance, no cushioning. You were scared and exhausted on a street in the rain and you still checked before you took help. That is not a person who runs toward the nearest safe thing and calls it love. That is a person who takes nothing at face value, including her own feelings, and earns every conclusion she reaches. He paused. I know you. I have watched you earn every conclusion you reached about me, about us. I trust what you arrived at. She looked at him for a long time. The harbor wind moved between them. She felt the question, the one she'd been carrying for 2 weeks, shift in her chest. Not dissolve. She wasn't built for clean dissolutions. She'd never been the kind of person who could put a thing down and not feel its absence. But shift. Move from the category of unresolved weight to something more like a settled truth, the kind you lived with rather than against. I love you, she said. Not because you saved me. I know, he said. Because of who you are, she said. Every difficult, complicated, unglamorous part of it. I know, he said again, quietly. I just needed to hear myself say it that way, she said, without the gratitude in the same breath. Just that. Just what it is. He reached out and took her hand on the railing. Not dramatically, just took it, held it. She looked at their hands and then at the city across the water, and she breathed in the cold air and thought about where she'd been a year ago. The $11.40, the landlord's message, the walk in the rain that had been routine until it wasn't, the alarm she'd almost talked herself out of listening to, and she thought about where she was standing right now, on a rooftop she had designed above a space she had made real, with the kind of work behind her that she'd spent 3 years trying to reach, and the kind of person beside her that she hadn't known she was looking for because she hadn't known the shape of it yet. The shape of it was this. Difficult. Honest. Real. Come back downstairs, she said. Ray is going to come looking for me in about 4 minutes, and I want to be findable. 4 minutes, Luca said. I timed him. He made the sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else, and she'd learned to love that sound, the particular quality of amusement in a man who hadn't always had much to be amused by. She squeezed his hand once and let go and turned toward the rooftop door. He followed. They went back down into the warmth and the noise and the life of the opening, and Ray Coletti found them in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, which was close enough that she was briefly smug about it, and the night continued its excellent work of being a night worth having. The months after that moved the way good months moved when you were finally building something sustainable rather than just surviving. Not without difficulty, not without the complicated textures of 2 lives intersecting at every level, but with the specific momentum of things that were pointed in the right direction. Alara's design practice grew, not dramatically at first, not the overnight transformation of a story that needed things to happen fast, but steadily, the way growth happened when you had the right foundation. The Coletti project became a portfolio piece that attracted other developers, other architects, other people building things in the city who needed someone with the particular vision she brought to material spaces. She hired an assistant in May, a 23-year-old from the Bronx named Davia, who had the same raw talent and financial precarity that Alara had carried 3 years ago, and who looked at the Red Hook project photographs with an expression Alara recognized from the inside. She gave Davia the job. She gave her a real salary and a clear set of responsibilities, and the specific information about which agencies were worth approaching and which ones would waste her time, which was the opposite of the experience Alara had had. And she did it because it was the right thing, and because she could, and because the version of herself that had stood outside Cafe Meridian at 12:18 in the morning with $11.40 deserved to have that choice extended forward in time to someone else who needed it. Luca noticed but didn't comment. That was how he noticed things that mattered. He saw them and let them stand without narrating them, which she'd come to understand as its own form of respect. Marco returned to the organization in a reduced capacity in March, after a period of distance and a series of conversations that Luca told Alara about in the factual, stripped-down way he told her things. Not seeking her verdict, not performing transparency, just keeping her genuinely informed. The 11 years couldn't be undone, and the choices Marco had made had cost something real and permanent between them. But he was alive. He was working. The thing he'd done in those 4 months, the risk of it, the cost of it, the way he'd tried to locate a knife with one hand while keeping his face neutral with the other, hadn't gone unacknowledged. Some things could not be repaired. Some things could be carried forward differently. Luca understood that distinction in his bones. She thought Alara was teaching him that some things could also simply be forgiven, given enough time and enough evidence of the thing being different. She thought he was learning it slowly, which was the only way that kind of learning happened. On a Saturday evening in late October, a year and 3 weeks from the night she had walked home in the rain, Alara stood on the roof of the penthouse and looked at Manhattan and thought about the version of herself who had stood on this same roof and looked at this same city and felt the specific terror of someone who had nearly not made it back from a walk she took every night. She didn't feel that now. She felt the cold of the October air and the particular quality of the city light at this hour, amber and fractured, and the weight of a year's worth of decisions that she had made with her eyes open and her instincts engaged and her hand on the railing when she needed it and not when she didn't. She heard the rooftop door. Luca came out with 2 glasses because he had apparently decided it was a 2 glasses kind of evening, and he handed one to her without commentary and stood beside her at the railing and looked at the city with her. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the walk," she said. "That night. I've been thinking about whether I would have taken the coffee if I hadn't been so tired, if the shifts hadn't been cut, if the landlord hadn't sent the message that day." She looked at the view. Whether tired was the variable. The tired was always going to be there, he said. That's what that kind of predator counts on. The tired, the social pressure, the not wanting to seem ungrateful. He looked at the city. You were tired, and you took the cup, and you still noticed when something was wrong. That's the thing you don't take away from yourself. She was quiet. "I know," she said. "I just think about it sometimes." "That's allowed," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the city, and the October light was doing something to his face that made the sharp angles of it softer, less defended. And she looked at him the way she sometimes let herself look at him when he wasn't watching, with the full, unguarded attention of someone who had chosen this person deliberately and found, repeatedly, that the choice held up under examination. She set down her glass on the parapet. She turned to face him. He turned too. She looked at him in the cold amber light with the city spread behind him and the year between them, and she said, "Ask me." He looked at her. "Ask me," she said again, steadily. He set down his own glass. He reached into his jacket pocket, and she felt her breath go slow and deliberate, the way it did when something real was happening. And he took out something small and held it between them without ceremony, without performance, without the scripted language of a moment being constructed. Just Luca Moretti, holding a thing that meant something, looking at her the way he looked at everything he cared about, directly, without deflection, without the comfort of distance. "I'm not a safe person," he said. "I told you that a long time ago." "You did," she said. "That's still true. The world I live in has quieted down, but it hasn't gone away, and it won't." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you that again so you have the full information, so the answer you give is the answer you mean." "I always mean my answers," she said. "I know." Something crossed his face. "That's why I'm asking." He held it out to her. Simple. A band of dark metal with a single pale stone, nothing ornate, nothing performing its own significance. Something chosen by a man who had never needed objects to announce their importance. "Alara Quinn," he said, "will you stay?" Not will you marry me, the formal question, the expected one. Will you stay? The question that meant everything it said and nothing less. The question that had been between them from the first morning in the kitchen when she'd had every practical reason to leave and had stood at the door and not left. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about the 37 floors and the drawer become 2 drawers and the Coletti project and Davia and Marco and the warehouse in Greenpoint and the 5 seconds and the year of Thursdays and the honest, difficult, unglamorous, exact thing that had grown between 2 people who had both learned the cost of not paying attention to what was real. She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she looked at it on her hand and said, "Yes, obviously yes. You know that." "I wanted to hear it," he said. "I wanted to say it," she said. He pulled her in, and this time there was no count, no operational timeline, no warehouse floor with other things requiring resolution. Just his arms around her and the city spread below them in its patient amber light, and her face against his shoulder, and the specific quality of being held by someone who had chosen to hold rather than control, to open rather than manage, to stay rather than retreat. The city below them continued its incomprehensible project of itself. 100,000 windows lit and dark, 100,000 lives in motion, all of them proceeding through the ordinary difficulty of existing in a place that didn't always notice you, that sometimes looked away at the critical moment, that demanded more than it gave back for years at a stretch, before it offered anything like a return. That was the city? That was the deal. Alara Quinn had walked into it 3 years ago with a portfolio no one wanted and enough belief in her own talent to keep going, when everything else said stop. And she had kept going through the bad math and the cut shifts and the $12 alternatives and the Fridays with a man in a corner booth whose attention had the particular quality of something wrong. And she had paid the cost of that exhausted, pressured, socially conditioned moment of accepting a cup she should not have taken. And she had survived the cost. And she had come out the other side of it with a life she had not planned, but had chosen at every step with full knowledge of what she was choosing. She was 27 now. She was a designer with a practice and a client who called her the real thing. She was a woman who had listened to her instincts when it mattered most and would never again apologize for listening to them. She was standing on a rooftop in Manhattan with a ring on her finger and a man beside her who had looked at her work with the attention it deserved, and at her with the same. Below them, the city hummed and shifted and moved through its October night, indifferent as always, enormous as always. It had never promised her anything. It had simply been the place where things happened, the backdrop against which 2 people had found each other in the specific, unrepeatable way that people found each other. Through difficulty and crisis and honesty and the slow, patient accumulation of trust built out of real material rather than wishful thinking. She lifted her face from his shoulder. She looked at the city. She thought, "I am not afraid of you." She thought, "I never really was." She thought, "I was afraid of being invisible to you." And then she stopped thinking about the city entirely, because the man beside her was looking at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had come to know as the truest version of him. Not the crime boss, not the feared name, not the man who ran things in the dark spaces of the city, just a man who had spent a long time alone in a life he'd built to survive rather than to live, and who had opened a door one rainy night and found something he hadn't known he was looking for. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That this is exactly what I wanted," she said. "Not what I planned. What I wanted." He looked at her. "Those can be the same thing," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm learning that." He took her hand. She held it. And New York glittered below them, vast and lit and indifferent and magnificent, the way it always had and always would, while 2 people stood on a rooftop above it and chose, one more time, the difficult and honest and irreplaceable thing they had found in each other. Not safety, not rescue. Home.